Pigs are, by almost every practical measure, one of the best animals on Earth to farm for food. They grow fast. They convert feed into meat more efficiently than cows or sheep. They can eat almost anything, including scraps other animals won't touch. And pork is, right now, the single most consumed meat on the planet. And yet, roughly a quarter of the world's entire population, well over 1 billion people, won't touch it. Not because it's rare, not because it's expensive, not because it's hard to raise. For a huge share of humanity, pork isn't just unpopular, it's forbidden. So here's the actual question worth asking. What did one specific animal do to earn a permanent ban across some of the largest religions on Earth, while cows, chickens, and goats never got the same treatment? The answer turns out to be a genuinely strange mix of ancient survival math, religious law, and a scientific myth that most people still believe today, even though it's been mostly debunked. Let's start with where this actually comes from, because the rule is older and more specific than most people realize. In the Hebrew Bible, the book of Leviticus lays out a detailed system for which animals are permissible to eat and which aren't. The general rule for land mammals is that an animal must both chew its cud and have a completely split hoof to be considered kosher. Cows, sheep, and goats pass both tests. Pigs have a split hoof, but they don't chew cud, and that single technical failure is enough to place them permanently outside the category of acceptable food under Jewish dietary law. Islamic dietary law, laid out in the Quran, arrives at essentially the same conclusion through a more direct route. Pork is explicitly named as forbidden, grouped alongside a small handful of other prohibited foods like blood and carrion. Unlike the kosher system's more technical checklist, the Quran's prohibition on pork is stated plainly and specifically. Two of the largest religious traditions on Earth, developed in the same general region of the ancient world, independently landed on the exact same animal as off-limits. That's not a coincidence anyone disputes. The real debate, the one scholars and researchers have argued about for well over a century, is why pigs specifically ended up on that list in the first place. If you ask most people why pork is forbidden in these traditions, you'll usually get the same answer. Pigs carry disease, especially a parasite called trichinosis, and ancient people figured out that eating pork could make you seriously sick. It's a satisfying explanation, and it's not entirely wrong. Pork genuinely can carry trichinosis if it's undercooked, and it genuinely was a real health risk in the ancient world. But researchers studying ancient dietary law have pointed out a fairly serious problem with using this as the primary explanation. Cows, sheep, and virtually every other animal humans have ever eaten also carry their own dangerous parasites and pathogens if improperly prepared. Undercooked beef carries genuine risks. Untreated water carries genuine risks. Nothing about trichinosis specifically singles pigs out as uniquely dangerous compared to the general risks of eating any animal in the ancient world. There's also a more basic problem with the disease theory. The obvious solution to a foodborne illness risk is simply cooking the meat thoroughly. Exactly the same solution humans applied to virtually every other disease-carrying food throughout history. A permanent, total ban is a considerably more extreme response than the situation would seem to require, if disease avoidance were really the primary motivation. Something else appears to be doing most of the actual work here. This is where a genuinely interesting alternative explanation comes in, one developed most notably by the American anthropologist Marvin Harris in the 1970s, built around the basic environmental reality of the ancient Middle East rather than disease at all. Pigs, biologically, are poorly suited to hot, arid climates. Unlike cows, sheep, or goats, pigs can't sweat effectively, and they have no efficient way to cool themselves down in extreme heat without access to mud, shade, or standing water. In a genuinely hot, dry region with limited water resources, keeping pigs alive and healthy required a level of environmental support the local ecosystem simply couldn't reliably provide. There's a second, arguably even bigger problem specific to pigs. Cows, sheep, and goats are ruminant grazers. They can survive largely on grass and scrub vegetation, food that's abundant across open rangeland, and critically, food humans can't eat themselves. Pigs are fundamentally different. They're omnivores with digestive systems closer to humans, and in practice, raising them at any real scale meant feeding them grains, nuts, and food scraps, exactly the same category of food that ancient farming communities needed for themselves. In a region where arable land and surplus food were often scarce and unpredictable, a pig wasn't just an inconvenient animal to raise. It was, in a very direct sense, competing with humans for the same limited food supply. Under this theory, the religious prohibition on pork wasn't really about the animal's health risk at all. It was about codifying, through religious law, a practical survival lesson that ancient pastoral and semi-nomadic communities across the region had already learned the hard way. Pigs simply didn't make sense as livestock in this specific environment, and turning that practical lesson into a permanent religious rule ensured the behavior stuck across generations, long after anyone individually remembered exactly why. This raises a genuinely reasonable question worth addressing directly. If pigs were simply impractical to raise in this environment, why did the prohibition need to become a formal religious law at all? Wouldn't people just naturally stop raising an animal that was inconvenient to keep? Researchers studying the archaeology of the ancient Near East have found something that helps explain this. Pig bones do show up in the archaeological record across parts of the ancient Levant, particularly in settled agricultural communities with more reliable access to water and shade, exactly the conditions pigs actually need. But pig remains are notably rare or entirely absent at sites associated with more mobile, pastoral populations, the exact groups whose descendants would go on to develop much of the religious tradition that eventually codified the prohibition. This pattern suggests something important. Pig keeping wasn't universally impossible across the region. It was specifically incompatible with a mobile, pastoral lifestyle, the kind built around herding sheep, goats, and cattle across open land rather than staying rooted in one place near a stable water source. For a settled farming village, keeping a few pigs around might make practical sense. For a herding community constantly on the move, a pig was a genuine liability, an animal that couldn't travel well, couldn't tolerate heat, and competed directly for food. Turning a practical, environment-specific distinction into a firm, permanent religious rule accomplished something a loose cultural habit couldn't. It created a clear, stable, group-wide identity marker, one that held steady even as individual circumstances shifted over time, even as some communities eventually did settle down in places where pigs might have become perfectly viable to raise again. There's a third layer worth examining directly, because researchers studying comparative religion have pointed out that dietary laws frequently do more than manage practical survival concerns. They also function as identity markers, ways a specific community visibly distinguishes itself from surrounding groups. In the ancient Near East, pigs were commonly raised and eaten by several neighboring cultures, including various groups the early Israelites had complicated, sometimes openly hostile relationships with. Some historians and anthropologists have argued that avoiding pork specifically wasn't purely about the animal's practicality at all. It became a visible, easily enforced way of maintaining a clear boundary between one's own community and outside groups, a dietary line that was simple to observe, simple to enforce socially, and instantly recognizable. Once a prohibition like this becomes embedded in religious law and reinforced across many generations, it tends to persist as core cultural and religious identity, regardless of whether the original underlying practical justification, disease risk, resource competition, climate mismatch still applies in a given individual's specific circumstances. A Jewish or Muslim family living today in a cool, water-abundant climate with easy access to refrigeration and modern food safety standards faces none of the original practical problems ancient herders in the desert dealt with. The dietary law persists anyway, because at this point it's functioning as something considerably deeper than a practical survival strategy. It's functioning as a core marker of religious identity and continuity, exactly the kind of practice specifically designed to remain stable across changing circumstances rather than adjust with them. It's worth being genuinely clear that pork avoidance isn't remotely universal, because looking at where it doesn't apply actually reinforces how specific and regional this whole pattern really is. China alone raises and consumes roughly half of all the pigs on Earth, and pork sits at the absolute center of Chinese cuisine, culturally and practically, with a history stretching back thousands of years. Across large parts of Europe, pork has long been one of the most commonly eaten meats, valued historically for the simple, practical reason that pigs could be raised efficiently on food scraps that would otherwise go to waste, a genuinely useful trait in temperate climates with reliable water access. Throughout the Americas, pork remains a completely ordinary, unremarkable staple. So the real pattern here isn't that humans broadly avoid pigs. Most of the world doesn't. The genuinely specific, narrower story is why two major religious traditions, both originating in roughly the same hot, arid region of the ancient world, independently arrived at the same conclusion about the same specific animal, and why that conclusion has remained a firm, actively observed religious practice for thousands of years. Since long after the original environmental conditions that likely shaped it in the first place stopped applying to most of the people still following the rule today. So the honest answer here was never really about pigs being dirty, diseased, or somehow biologically unfit to eat. Pork is eaten safely and and enjoyed enormously by a huge share of humanity today, with modern food safety standards making the original trichinosis risk almost entirely preventable through basic cooking. The real explanation is considerably more layered than a single myth about disease. It's an animal poorly suited to a specific hot, arid environment, an animal that directly competed with ancient humans for scarce food and water in exactly the regions where these religious traditions first took shape, a practical survival lesson that got formalized into permanent religious law, and eventually a dietary practice that transformed into something considerably more important than practicality alone. A lasting, deliberately unchanging marker of religious identity and continuity across thousands of years of history. The pig was never actually the problem. The environment it first collided with, and the identity that eventually formed around avoiding it, turned out to be the real story all along. If this video changed how you think about one of the world's most debated dietary rules, hit like, subscribe for more, and let me know in the comments. Did you already know the real reason, or did you believe the disease myth like most people do?